go. Paul, do you have a question?
Yes, want to know, is it okay to open up the chat window and ask questions there?
Yes, please do. We encourage that. Thank
Got
you.
it.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jonas Cartano. I'm from Third Eye Cultural Collaborative. And I've been working with Lisa Simmons from Mass Cultural Council on this series of 4 webinars about festival audiences. This webinar is actually the 4th of the summer. So this is our last one. And these webinars are being recorded and will be posted onto Mass Cultural Council's website. I am just about to put in to the chat their YouTube page, and the previous webinars are also listed in the chat. But basically, if you go to Mass Cultural Council's website and look for anything in this summer that mentions festivals, that's probably one of our webinars. And if you see me talking, you're definitely in the right place. As Paul asked, we encourage you to actively use the chat function and post questions and comments throughout the webinar. Angela might see the chat and address some questions and comments along the way, but I'll also be monitoring it throughout just to make sure that we circle back and catch any questions that we may have missed along the way. Angela, why don't you go ahead and pull up the agenda piece, the agenda slide, and I'll just put folks through here.
Yeah. So, and good morning, everyone. I don't think I actually said good morning. I've only had a couple sips of coffee.
Do you want to just advance through to the agenda slide, and I'll just talk through what we're going to talk about today. So this is our super simple agenda today. We're already in the introduction stage, and then we'll move into kind of using audience survey data, where we'll talk about kind of why this might help you in your festival planning. We'll talk about how to collect survey responses and various methods of collection. And then designing survey questions, talking about some basic advice on survey questions, and then a little bit about data storage and quality and the importance of kind of collecting clean and user-friendly data, because you don't want to be spending hours and hours cleaning up Excel sheets and that sort of thing. And you know, it's a relatively small audience today, so we might do questions and discussions along the way at various points. We'll check in, but as Paul asked, you know, please use the chat actively, and we'll try to pick up questions along the way and address them in the process. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Angela Hahn to you. She and I are co-founders of Third Eye Cultural Collaborative. Her experience in the nonprofit cultural sector has included kind of local and national organizations, and she's worked as an executive director for an orchestra, a science educator for a museum, a policy researcher, and then, you know, most important for today's discussion, she was also the lead project manager in developing the Festivals Toolkit with Mass Cultural Council's Festivals program. Angela, I'll let you take it away from here.
Great. Yeah. So, so hello, everyone. And let's see if I remember how to use Zoom and how to advance my slides, because some days it's a hard thing to do in the morning. So we have some idea of the people in the room just because you did register for this webinar in advance, but it would be great if you could just introduce yourselves in the chat. It's a little bit, I think, too large of a group to do it kind of in person, but if you want to just let us know, you know, who you are, the festival that you're representing, where it is, when the next one is, and then just kind of what you're thinking, since I imagine many of you have been rethinking festival formats, but it's just a way for us to get to know you a little bit better. And feel free to do that in the chat. As Jonas mentioned, I and actually Jonas and also our colleague Allison, we were all involved in managing audience-led festivals, which was an initiative of Arts Austin, put on in collaboration with the Mass Cultural Council. And there's a couple of festivals actually who participated in that program who I see are on the webinar, so that's really nice to see. But I would say the things we're going to talk about today and the toolkit that Jonas referenced, that I'll also reference again in a minute, all this content and the way we chose to focus on all of this really came out of the year that we spent working with festivals on topics like marketing and audience development. And it was a range of festivals. So this is just the 10 that participated in that year-long program. After that year-long program, we actually put together a toolkit as a resource. There are hundreds of festivals in Massachusetts, and we only were able to work with 10 directly through the Audience Lab Festivals program. And so the aim of the toolkit was to try to take the learnings from that experience and put them into a resource that anybody could access. What we're going to talk about today, a lot of that content is actually in the toolkit, and it's in particular, it's in the audience data collection section. So if you go to the Mass Cultural Council website, you can go ahead and access that. You can access the entire resource, but then this particular, I would say this particular chapter is the one that we really drew on to talk about surveying today. So we, actually, let me back up for a second and just give a little bit more context. Audience surveying is kind of an important component of data collection. And it's something that we felt made a lot of sense to focus on in terms of festivals, because it's a piece that's really important, and it's a piece of data collection that I think is particularly challenging for festivals, just because many of you tend to be fairly open events, right? You might be free or low cost, and so you don't necessarily have kind of a point of contact with a ticket purchase. A lot of you are also in maybe physical spaces that tend to be fairly open, and so again, there isn't a natural point of contact for you to be able to interact with everyone coming in the door, and so it tends to be a little bit of a challenge to do something like audience surveying, and so that's why we thought it made sense to really focus on that today. I'm gonna go through, Jonas walked through the agenda and the agenda items, and I'm gonna go through kind of the agenda in an order that some of you might think is a little bit backwards. I actually want to start off by talking about using the data, right? So once you've actually figured out the questions you want to ask, you've collected it, then you need to make use of it. But I want to start off with that first, because I actually think it's really important to be able to think about what is it that you're going to do with this data in order to inform all of the steps around collecting the data itself, right? You really need to think about things like, what are your goals? How are you going to use it? Because that really informs things like, what are the kinds of questions you're going to ask? Or even how are you going to store that data? There was a previous webinar that I think was 2 weeks ago, Jonas. It was a couple of weeks ago that Jonas and Allison put on that was more broadly about collecting data. And so this is just a slide from that presentation. And Allison, just gave an overview of data collection and data collection for cultural organizations in particular. And I would say doing something like an audience survey is a subset of this, right? So collecting data directly from your audiences is a particular type of data collection. You're targeting a specific stakeholder group within your organization, and they're uniquely positioned to answer questions because typically for audience data, you're asking people questions about themselves, and they're really the ones who are best equipped to answer questions about themselves. But I just want to acknowledge that kind of collecting audience data is part of this kind of larger desire to collect data, to understand yourself better, and to then be able to make decisions like we've got laid out in this table. In terms of collecting audience data specifically, and doing it through something like an audience survey, there's a couple of questions that I think are good to start with. And again, along the theme of, how are you going to analyze and make use of this survey data, right? So, when you sit down and you think about this, I think it's important to think through questions like, what are your actual goals? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? What is it that asking your audiences directly is going to help you either achieve your goal or understand if you've achieved your goal? And then kind of relatedly, I would say these last two questions are very much related to that. And it's how are you going to use the data and what's the specific data you need to collect? So I've just got a couple of examples to just show you what I'm trying to talk about. And these are examples pulled from either the festivals program, the Audience Lab Festivals program, or actually from the previous Audience Lab cohort, which was a cohort of Greater Boston Performing Arts organizations. So the data, the examples I'm going to pull up actually use real data, but everything is kind of anonymized, just so you know. Let's just say, okay. Let's just say as an example, you are an arts organization who wants to understand if the demographics of your audiences actually reflects the demographics of your community. And when I say demographics, that can mean a lot of different things. In this particular example, it's actually talking about income. And so here you've got actually a theater that was able to provide information or collect enough information about the income of their audiences through audience surveying, to be able to take a look at what their audiences look like with respect to their annual income. And then they also actually pulled secondary data, so data they did not directly collect, but they pulled data about the income breakdown of people who live in the greater Boston area. And so this is a piece of information that can help them understand, do our patrons reflect the demographics of our community with respect to income? If they don't, how do we feel about that, right? Is there something that we want to do differently in our work in terms of attracting audiences, questions like that? In this particular example, the specific data that you need to collect is you need to know household income. So that's a question that you would need to ask your audiences. You'd actually also need to know where they live, right? Just because someone comes to your theater or your event in your town doesn't mean they live in your town. And it doesn't even necessarily mean they live anywhere close to your town. So in this particular example, you really want to restrict it to people who live in the greater metro area. And then, as I mentioned, there's secondary data they use to be able to compare their information. And so you would actually also need that in terms of data. Another example is of a question that you might ask yourself is, let's say you're the marketing director, or you're responsible for making the marketing decisions for your event. And you're wondering, I've got this great marketing campaign that I want to launch for people under 40, and it uses physical advertising. So where is it that I should be targeting my physical advertising? So again, this particular arts organization actually knew something about the patrons who came to their organization, and they knew something about their age and their zip code. And so they were able to create this map and understand where they already had a concentration of patrons under 40. And that kind of information can actually help you understand how you might want to target a question like this marketing campaign for patrons under 40. So again, here they had to know data like what is the age, so they asked their audiences what their age is, and also where they lived. And then this particular map, I think they did it by town. So that's the piece of information that they needed. Another example, I think, is your goals I wouldn't say your goals have to be like incredibly huge or incredibly complicated. I imagine many of you have got goals like simply being able to have access to contact information to a larger audience, right? If you've got email communications or social media posts that you push out, you want to be able to grow the size of the audience that you can reach through those channels. And so if you wanted to, for example, reach more people through your email communications, that in terms of the data that you need, that's fairly straightforward. You really just need email addresses. So you need a way to actually be able to collect that specific piece of data. And here we've actually just pulled up 2 examples of social media campaigns to try to attract more email addresses. Those are fairly simple ways to do it. If I would say kind of the easiest way to do it is just collect email addresses, but it's probably likely that you'd also like to know things like their name or maybe specific things that they're interested in case you want to target your communications. But that's just another example of how you might want to use your data. So, Jonas, actually, I'm just going to pause right now and see if there's any questions.
No, nothing has come up yet in the chat, although we encourage that. I I do have a question just around both of these examples are incentivizing joining the email list. So it looks like a chance to win tickets for both of these. So what's kind of your take on incentivizing participation?
Yeah, so I think in this particular example, I think incentivizing is actually a really great way to go, just because I know Arts Boston actually does this, perhaps not this year, but I think in previous years, it's been pretty common for Arts Boston to do things like incentivize with tickets to be able to grow their mailing list. And they've actually found a huge amount of success doing things like that. And what they've done there is they've gone to their social media audience, which I think is larger than their email audience, and just encourage that kind of engagement and that kind of touch point. And then the main benefit is that they're able to grow their email list.
There you go. So like tickets or merchandise that maybe like festival t-shirts, things like that might be possible incentives. And then you could just kind of do a random drawing out of all of the people who responded. You do a random drawing and you can send those out by mail. Nothing too crazy, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. That's great.
Okay. So we're actually going to move on to the next section, and the next section is really around how to collect survey responses. So let's say you thought about, okay, I know how to use, I know how I'm going to make use of my data. I have an idea of kind of what the purpose of it is. You've also probably put some thought into like, what are the kinds of questions I need to ask? And we're going to get to that in another section, but I actually want to spend a couple of minutes thinking about what are the different methods you can use. And when I say methods, there's a couple things that you should think through first. But when I say methods, I'm actually really thinking about like, what's the format? And then once you think through the format, you can also just think through what are different ways to actually incentivize things like completing the survey itself. But I think a couple questions that are important to think about when you think about what's the method that makes the most sense for me. The first is, how quickly do I need to record, analyze, and make use of the data? For example, if it's you want to collect audience data to plan for next year's festival, but you don't plan for next year's festival until kind of 6 months after you've completed 1 year, you've got some lead time. And so, that maybe that will help you understand, what kind of data collection method you may or may not want to use. And then similarly, what system is the most appropriate to collect the data? Some of you may have staff or volunteers who are fairly data savvy. And so you can do something like set up a database. And then for those of you who maybe don't have a staff person or a volunteer with that kind of skill set, you're not going to want to set up something complicated. You're going to want to set up something that's very simple. But I think these are questions that are important to ask yourselves at the outset. In terms of collection methods, I'm just going to go through a couple of types and just talk through kind of the pros and cons of them, and then also just show a couple of examples of different collection methods. First is a paper survey. I'm assuming we are all very familiar with paper surveys and have filled them out at our fair share of events. I think the advantages, they're cheap, they're easy to use. You can also actually use them to collect data in person during an event. And so that's actually something that's a pretty big advantage. I would say the primary advantages are really around the interaction that you might have with the audience person completing the survey, right? It tends to be fairly easy for someone to do it if you intersect with the audience person at the right moment. In terms of disadvantages, it's kind of everything that happens after someone completes the survey, right? There tend to be errors. You can't always read everyone's handwriting. They don't always complete all the questions, and you can't force someone to do that in a paper survey. you actually do need to set up some kind of database or maybe a spreadsheet to be able to enter all the data, and you would need someone to actually enter that data by hand, which again is another point of possible error. Maybe someone just doesn't type in the information quite correctly. And then even though I think paper surveys in a lot of contexts make it really easy to collect data during an event, it's much more difficult to try to use something like that to collect data before or after an event, because you don't really have those people to interact with. Next option, there's actually a lot of digital platforms that provide surveying capability. So just a couple of examples: Eventbrite, Google Forms, SurveyMonkey, Facebook Events. There's there's a lot of different options, and I would say many of these are free and or low cost to use and actually quite user friendly. I think I've actually used all of these, and so I would say they're all reasonably user friendly to set up and kind of get your questions set up and things like that. A number of them have got analytical tools built in. In particular, I've personally used Google Forms and SurveyMonkey, and actually I feel like every time I go back and visit either of those platforms, there's actually more and more data analysis that they have built in into those platforms. And so that's something that's actually really, that can be really helpful for you, because you don't have to worry so much about doing the analysis on the back end, as long as you've set up the questions well. If it's a digital or some kind of online platform, it's also relatively easy to collect data before, during, or after the event if you have the ability to contact your audiences before and after the event. Couple of disadvantages: there is some limited functionality. So, for example, if there's a very complicated analysis you want to do, these platforms can't really do it. You would still need to do that analysis on your own. I wrote that a disadvantage is that these platforms require a separate database and require you to export data into a separate database. I've certainly worked with my fair share of organizations that just keep their data inside Google Forms or keep their data inside SurveyMonkey. I would recommend that you take that data out and put it in a different place. It's fine if you store it in kind of the platform you use to collect the data, but you want to make sure that you have a copy. You kind of have your own copy in a different place. Because it's your data, and you want to make sure that you always have access to it. You're able to make use of it. Something else that I want to point out that I used actually in the examples up in the beginning is around using secondary data. I think secondary data is really useful and powerful. I wouldn't necessarily advocate for using it as the only source of your data. And when I say secondary data, I mean data you don't directly collect from your audiences. The example I used before of the example theater that looked at the household income of their patrons and compared it to the household income of just kind of everyone in the Boston area. The household income of everyone in the Boston area is an example of the secondary data. So, you go to some place like the census or a database that collects that kind of information, and you can make use of that data. And that's really powerful because it actually allows you to compare pieces of information that perhaps you could not have before. And that's this concept of linking data that you didn't directly collect. A couple of disadvantages to using secondary data is one, you actually, if you want to match your data to a secondary data set, you actually need to collect the data in the exact same way that the secondary data set is constructed. So for example, again, in the household income example, if the data that you're using, specifies household income divided up into groups of $10,000, you would have to ask your question in the exact same way so that you are actually able to compare your data to the other data source. And then similarly, you might have to collect your data in a very particular format, depending on the kind of data that you're trying to compare it to. So these are things that you need to keep in mind if you want to be able to use your data and connect it to other sources of data. The last type of collection method, which I'll just touch on really briefly, is using a database. So something like Tessitura or Salesforce. These are platforms that are very powerful and can be customized. Disadvantages, they tend to be more expensive. I think we all probably have access to some kind of spreadsheet software like Excel or Google Sheets. Unless you've paid money, you probably don't have access to a database software. They also just conceptually are more complex, and they require some level of specialized knowledge to be able to make use of. I wanted to pull up a couple of examples of collection methods, and specifically an example of a paper form and an online platform, because I'm guessing that those are the two most common ways that you're going to make use of, two most common ways you're going to try to survey your audiences. And so this first example up here is of a paper form. It's not an arts specific or a festival specific survey, but I think it's one that's actually really helpful to see. This is actually an example from the Audience Lab partner, the Mass Voter Table. And they use this quite often they use this format quite often when they are tabling events, kind of in various places. So as you can see here, it's set up as a postcard format, and it is in fact the size of a postcard. It is a fairly simple, straightforward postcard, right? And it asks for some information that's fairly crucial for this, I would say, some of the topics that the Mass Voter Table cares about. So you can just see, on the left, you've got name and contact information, and also at the top, so those are pieces of information that they need to be able to stay connected with people that they are getting input from. Also some information that they're collecting about how they should be communicating with people who are responding to this postcard. And then in the lower right, those are kind of I would say the topical areas. So just understanding what are different kind of issues or topics that they might want to connect with people about. So I like this postcard. I like using it as an example because it packs a lot of information in, but it's actually not a very large format. And I think it's very easy for the average person to respond to fairly quickly. And so they're fairly likely to actually respond to the kind of all of the questions on it. So that kind of postcard, that's something that you would do, let's say at your festival, right? If you've got people at an event. And so just a couple of tips that we wanted to go through about, collecting audience data when you're in person at an event. One, I think it's important to actually have dedicated people who are responsible for actually administering and collecting surveys. Whether it's a physical survey or a digital survey, right? Just making sure you've got some people who are dedicated to doing that and are actually trained in what it is that they're supposed to do. So encouraging complete responses and encouraging accurate responses from the people that they're surveying. Try to think of a way to set up a station near a natural bottleneck at your event. I think the events that you're all running are kind of run the gamut. And so where that location might be, I think is very, very different. But just think about where there might be a natural bottleneck where people are waiting. And so while they're waiting, it's really easy to approach them and ask them to spend a couple of minutes responding to some survey questions. Kind of similarly, encourage the people that you've got who are administering and collecting survey responses to move around and to talk to people, especially taking advantage of opportunities where, like I said, they're waiting. If you're using a paper form, making copies of everything is really helpful. As a just in case, that's your data backup before you can actually get it into your spreadsheet or your database. And then if you're using some kind of digital form, just make sure that your staff or volunteers are actually able to access it. So everybody's got a tablet or everyone's got a computer and are able to interact with people to collect those responses. In terms of digital options, I actually wanted to highlight an example using Eventbrite. So in the toolkit, we actually set up an example, we kind of set up an example ticketing set up using Eventbrite. And so if you look, we've got the link down here, but also, again, if you go to the Mass Cultural Council website and look at the toolkit, this is linked to in the toolkit as well. And so basically what we did, or what Arts Boston did, was they knocked up kind of a fake festival event. And then if you go to that and you just click on the registration button, you can see the ticket that's been set up, and you can see the kind of information that they're asking for to sign up for the event. One thing I want to note is you can actually set up this kind of ticketing even if your event is free. And in fact, on Eventbrite, the last time I checked, Eventbrite, events that were free did not cost any money to set up tickets for. So in fact, you can make use of this. You can make use of this for no, like, kind of no out-of-pocket costs. Just a couple tips about collecting data online. Use a user-friendly website, and find ways to either encourage or require attendees to register for your event ahead of time. And like I said, even if it's free, you can still ask people to register. Most online forums will allow you to do things like require questions. And so if the purpose of setting up this form is for you to collect specific data, you should require that data when people are inputting it. In terms of audience surveying, it's actually important to collect data from every individual person, not just one person in a group. So try to set up the tickets to collect information in that way. And then again, at the event itself, you can actually set up some kind of station so that people who maybe didn't fill out the registration form in advance can actually provide their data to you at the event itself. So Jonas, I'm just going to pause here and see if there's any questions.
Sure. Yeah, and actually, I think there's probably a few questions that are floating around. Annie had asked, do we have any of these as templates that they might be able to use, especially the postcard?
Yeah, so the postcard, so again, the postcard you can access if you go to the toolkit, the Mass Cultural Council toolkit, and then same with that Eventbrite page. Like, you can link, there's a link that will take you to it, and then you can see how that ticket registration is set up.
There you go. So yeah, not templates per se, but easily copyable.
Yeah, examples. You're right, they're not templates, they're just examples.
Exactly. And Paul was asking about thoughts on creation of an audience panel to engage in ongoing surveys. Has any organizations done this? Anyone with experience? So if anybody on the webinar has experience doing kind of focus groups or audience panels, would love to hear from you. But yeah, Angela, any responses to that sort of approach?
Yeah, so I think I would actually, Paul, before you try to put together an audience panel, what I would actually suggest is you think a little bit about what is it that you want to learn from your audiences. I think something like a focus group or an audience panel, one of the benefits from that is that you actually get a lot of qualitative, subjective information. And so if what you're trying to learn, if you've got questions where you're not really quite sure what the question is, or you need a little bit more guidance to figure out what's the direction I want to go in, something like a focus group or an audience panel is a really great way to go. Like, let's say you're trying to start up a new event in your community, and you really need some feedback that's really open-ended. I think that's where you've got like a focus group or an audience panel. If instead your question is around, do we have a range of people of a range of ages who are coming to our event? That's something where you'd actually really need to count and quantify the people coming. And so then you would really need to survey people in this more kind of typical way that we're talking about here. So yeah, I think your questions really dictate how you maybe want to set up a method.
Yeah, so there's kind of this qualitative versus quantitative piece.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're looking at surveys or collecting data like that is typically quantitative, Surveys might be really helpful. You can get qualitative data as well with open-ended questions and things like that. But yeah, in terms of creating audience panels or focus groups, if you are looking for lots of qualitative data, lots of conversation about how people are experiencing things like that. Yeah, that might be a really good way to approach that. So yeah, depending on the data that you're looking for. That's a great question. And John was asking about accepted racial and ethnic names to gather. He tried that once, but couldn't agree on the identifier categories. And Paul also mentioned that that's a good question. And I think we've got something on that. Is that correct, Angela?
Yeah, we'll touch on an example. So actually, maybe if you wanna ask some questions after we go through some of those examples, we can talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
In a few
So
minutes.
answer pending on that one, John. I think. I think those are big questions that have come through the chat. And I think maybe one other piece that we should address during this section is maybe just, we've talked about different ways of collecting data through surveys, but I think some of the barriers or some of the questions that we found when we gathered data during the registration process for this webinar, we asked the question around, what are your biggest questions or barriers around surveying? And there were a lot of questions around kind of low response rate, or the quality of the responses, and collecting enough responses so that it's representative. So those are a few of those question areas that were brought up on the registration form.
Yeah, so I think, kind of all of those, again, I would go back to some of the kind of the tips about collecting data in person. That would be good to just keep in mind. I think dedicating time to doing this, I would say typically improves things like your response rate. Time, by time, I mean people. So that's one thing. I would also encourage you to be creative and to test out different ways to incentivize participation. Right, earlier we talked about like the social media example where you've got a ticket giveaway. That's something that might work for your festival. I feel like when we were running the Audience Lab Festivals program, we actually had a lot of creative ideas come out of there. I don't know if the people who are on the call who participated want to share some of those, but one idea I remembered is recruiting maybe younger volunteers, like middle school and high school students, to be the people going around asking for survey responses, because the thought was that, if a young person is asking you to do something for 5 minutes at the event, you're perhaps more likely to be responsive, and to pause and to offer to do that. I think there were also some ideas that came out about having just a really kind of eye-catching, enticing activity that involved people stopping. And so as part of that activity, actually inviting people to complete an audience survey. So they're naturally stopping there to participate, and then they can do the survey on the spot. So those are some ideas, but I would encourage you to be really creative about getting people to respond. And to just test out different ideas, and see what works, because I think what might work for your particular situation is not going to work for another, is not necessarily going to work for someone else.
I think that makes sense. Great. Yeah, I think we should move on. What do you think, Angela?
Yeah. So we've had you think a little bit about, how are you going to make use of this data, as in like the kind of the big why. Why are you doing this? How are you going to make use of this data that you're trying to collect from your audiences? How are you going to collect the data? And so now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how are you going to ask the questions to actually collect the data. And I will say, there's a couple things that we chose to focus on in terms of thinking about the questions. To be honest, I would actually also encourage you to simply just do an internet search, because I think survey questions are the kind of thing where you can find a lot of examples online. there's just a couple things here that I just want to prompt you to think about as you're designing your survey questions, right? So again, what is the specific data you need to collect? What is it that you really want to learn from your audiences? You know, just make sure that you've thought through that and understood what is it that you want to ask. I think something else that's important, which is related to what Jonas was saying about response rate and things like that, is how much information is my audience willing to provide? And I think in terms of being able to think through that, it's really helpful to take the time to test your survey, right? So once you've created some questions in whatever format you think is appropriate, asking a couple of people to simply test it out and give you feedback about how they think maybe audiences would respond to it is really important. I think actually similarly for the question around demographics, asking questions around race and ethnicity, I think different communities are comfortable, you know, have like kind of different levels of comfort with that type of question. And so again, it's just important for you to test it within your own community, right? And that can just be volunteers or staff, but just doing some testing to make sure you understand how all of this might be received or perceived or responded to, are things that are important to think about. So I'm just going to quickly touch on a couple different types of questions, just so you can just think through these as possible ways to ask questions, again, depending on what it is that you're trying to find out. And so here's just an example question. How did you find out about you know, this festival? When you're setting up a question, especially online, you know, you've got different ways to set up the answers. And so in this particular one, I wanted to focus on the idea of doing a single select or multiple select. And so by single select, I mean the respondent can only choose one option. And that's good if you're talking about a question that truly only has one answer. So I think you know, a really good example of that is if you're asking someone what their age is, right? That you can really only be one age, and so you can really only have one answer. So a single select option is probably the best choice for that type of question. You can also set up a question like this, you know, with multiple choice answers as a multiple select. So that means people can select more than one response as being true. And I think, in fact, the example question we've got up here, this is a good example of a question where the answer, more than one answer, is true, right? It's probably true that people found out about your festival in a couple of different ways. And so if more than one thing could possibly be true, you know, multiple select is probably the way to go. In terms of making use of the data afterwards or visualizing the data, I just want to know if you've got a single select answer, that's the kind of data that you could visualize as a pie chart, because you're forcing everyone to just choose one answer. Kind of all the answers will add up to 100%, and that's where you can use something like a pie chart. If you're asking people to multiple select, the answers are not going to add up to 100%. You know, they're going to add up probably to more than 100%. And so the visualization of a pie chart would not make any sense. And so you'd end up using something like a bar chart if you're someone who really finds visualizations useful. So that's single select versus multiple select. Another type of question that's really common, especially when you're surveying audiences, is a question where the response is on a Likert scale. And this kind of question, it's when you're asking someone for their opinion, something like their opinion or their level of satisfaction with something. You know, so this particular question is around, you know, some kind of presentation that people came and saw, and you want to ask them for their opinion about their presentation. So a Likert scale, I would recommend, I would say maybe no more than 7 options for Likert scale answers, and probably 4 or 5 is the better way to go. It allows you to get some response that's more nuanced than simply yes or no, right? If this was simply a yes or no question, it would ask something like, were you satisfied with the knowledge and teaching skills of the presenter, yes or no? But sometimes you want more nuanced feedback than that, and so that's why you would set up a Likert scale. This is a way for you to actually get input about people's opinions and quantify those responses. You know, if that is how you want to make use of this information, being able to count the responses and being able to count, you know, how many people have the opinion of being satisfied or very satisfied, then you'd want to use the Likert scale. If you're more interested in actually getting qualitative feedback, then you would structure this as an open-ended question. There's a couple different ways to construct Likert scales, and so we put up two options here, two examples. That first example, the range of responses, there's actually an odd number of responses, and then the second example, there's an even number of responses. And that's actually, if you're going to ask a question in this way, you actually want to put some thought into whether or not you want an odd number or even number of responses. If you put in an odd number, it allows people to actually have a neutral response, right? Neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. And if it's an even number, you're actually going to force people to express an opinion. They're either satisfied or dissatisfied, you know, or very dissatisfied or very satisfied. And so you just want to think a little bit about what is it that I really need to get from my audiences, and how, you know, do I want to allow them to be neutral about my question, or do I want them to actually express an opinion? So that's one thing to keep in mind when constructing a Likert scale. Also, it's I wrote here, questions should be focused and narrow. That's not unique to Likert scales. It's really helpful if, in general, if your questions are focused and narrow. You really want to ask one question at a time when you're asking people questions, because if you ask them more than one question at a time, you don't know if their answer is about you know, one part of the question or the other part of the question. So you want to make sure to narrow your questions as much as possible. Another type of question is an open-ended question. There were a couple of examples that I talked through that I said, here's what it would be like if it was open-ended. Open-ended questions, the benefit of doing that is it allows people to give feedback in ways that maybe you didn't anticipate, or allows them to give just much more qualitative, subjective feedback. It also, in general, I find it nice to end an audience survey with an open-ended question, just to make sure you're able to capture everything that your audience wants to tell you. So you can, I think oftentimes it's helpful to end your survey with something like, is there anything like you'd like to share that we haven't asked, things like that. So then you can just capture things that maybe you didn't realize people wanted to give you feedback on. I think open-ended questions are really helpful in that way. You can't really quantify responses from open-ended questions. That's not a bad thing. That's just simply a kind of a limitation of this type of question. Again, you want to make sure that these questions are focused and narrow. So this first example that I've got up, it asks you what you've learned or what you've liked at the festival today. And so people might put in different things depending on, what they think they learned or they liked. If for some reason you want to narrow that, I would recommend that you rephrase that question. So that's just an example of narrowing those questions. Here, someone had been asking about demographics. So in terms of asking about race and ethnicity, I would agree that there are a lot of different ways to ask about race and ethnicity. And again, I would go back to, what I was suggesting at the beginning, really trying to understand what it is that you can ask of your audiences. Because there are some, there's some audiences or some individuals that are more or less sensitive to being asked this question. This is, I would say, is a fairly wordy example, but it is one that that I got from a theater and they found it fairly successful to ask the question in this way. A couple of things that I want to flag when you're asking about race and ethnicity, in particular, I think personally, I always push to have this question be a multiple select question rather than a single select question, because there are many people who don't feel like one category is simply answering with one category is appropriate. I think also in a question like this that's maybe potentially sensitive, giving people the option to not answer. And I think having that line as a possible option, you can't really make use of that data. And so in a strict sense, you don't have to list that as an option, but I think just when people respond, being able to have the option to not answer and indicate that they don't want to that they want to answer the question, but they don't want to give you the information, I think is just kind of psychologically helpful. And so, and then I think also similarly, if people feel that, you know, kind of how they might identify, they might want to answer the question and how they might identify might not be on this list, giving them that option as well to be able to respond is also helpful. One thing you want to keep in mind in terms of making use of this data is if there's any, I would say if there's any secondary data that you want to use in addition to the data you collect from your audiences, you want to be careful that the demographic, that the possible answers actually line up with that. So for example, it's very common for people to use census data. And census data, the race and ethnicity questions are set up in a very specific way. So you'd want to make sure that your question really aligns with the census data, so you can pull that data and compare it.
Right. So Angela, I just wanted to check in with John to see if we addressed his question. And if that was
I'm more confused than ever right now. No,
What's
no,
you know?
no. Actually, I wouldn't have thought that level of wording would have been successful. But the more I'm looking at it, that I'm thinking, yes, it probably would be, because it comes at it as with lots of examples.
So yeah, so one way you could maybe make this question easier to scan is, for example, you could bold the first part of the answer, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So, you know, there's some people who would just go down the list very quickly, you know, and would just check off what they feel is appropriate. And then I think there's other people who appreciate the wordiness, and so then they might take the time to read it. But if you bold selected text, that's one way to make it easier for kind of that first group to scan. I just want to be clear, I'm not saying that you have to use this particular answer set, right? I'm simply offering it up as an example, and it's a little bit different from what other people might use. So I think it's an interesting one to offer up as an example.
Yeah, and
Thank
you know, if you do your Googling, you'll find a lot of different approaches. But I do think the what Angela was saying about the prefer not to answer, or you know, please specify for other is helpful, because you know, self-identity is different for different folks. So, great. Angela, we're nearing the end of our time together, and just wanted to check in with you. We have this quality section.
Yep. So I will talk fast.
Okay, sounds good.
So data storage and quality is just the last thing that I want to touch on. There's a couple of data storage options you have. Once you've collected all of your audience data, there's different ways that you can store that data. And so I've just put a couple of options up here. There's advantages and disadvantages to all of them. My kind of general recommendation I would say for this particular group is to start by storing your data in a spreadsheet. So something like Excel or Google Sheets, because it's much easier to figure out how to use and manage something like that compared to a database. If you've got a database expert on staff or a volunteer, great, task them with doing this. But I would not recommend that you learn that as a new skill right now. I would recommend that you stick with the spreadsheet. And I guess the other thing I would say is just please don't store your data as a PDF or Word document, because it's incredibly difficult to manage or analyze data out of those formats. Please put it in a spreadsheet. I just really quickly wanted to show two examples of how you can use a spreadsheet. So here, again, this is actually data from a festival that we've anonymized. Couple things about this setup that I just want to flag. One thing that's really good is that every row in this spreadsheet pertains to a single respondent. And I think one of the things that's key about keeping your data in a spreadsheet is you want all of your rows to be the same, and you want all of your columns to be the same. And what I mean by that here is if you look at each row, right? So if you look at row 2, everything in row 2 is about ln alpha and is only about ln alpha. If you look at column A are the names of the respondents, and the only piece of information in that column are the names. right? So everything in the column has to be alike in some way, and everything in the row has to be alike in some way. And so in that sense, this is a good way of keeping your data in a spreadsheet. You can actually improve on this though. So just for example, if you look in column B, so you'll notice everything in column B is about the respondent's occupation, right? It lists maybe their job title and then the company that they work for. But their job title and the company that they work for are actually two pieces of information. And so it would actually be even better if you could split that up into two columns. Similarly for the address, everything in column C is the address. Sometimes when you make use of data like an address, you want their address line, like their street name, and then their city and their state and their zip code to actually be separate pieces of data, because that's an easier way to manage that information. So an even better way to store this data in a spreadsheet is to do that, to break up the columns into smaller pieces of data. So in this example, again, the same, every row is about an individual respondent, and then every column is the same piece of data across the respondents. And then just moving quickly, a couple of hints about data quality. There, it is easy to kind of make input mistakes. And so what I've done here is just flagged a couple of input mistakes that are really easy to make. If you're using some kind of online form, or even if you're using a spreadsheet, there's actually ways that you can ask your online form or your spreadsheet to flag inputs that are not correct. So if you've got a column of data that's supposed to be all email addresses, you can oftentimes ask the spreadsheet to flag for you if the email address doesn't have an @ symbol. Same with phone numbers, things like that. So those are just some simple things about data quality that can actually really help improve, improve the data as you input it in, for you to then be able to make use of it on the other side. So I'm actually going to pause here because I realize we're out of time.
Thank you for quickly speeding through this. I think what might be easiest is if, I think Angela and I have a few minutes available to answer any additional questions, but, we are at times and want to respect everybody. So maybe what we'll do is we'll just close out, and I'll just mention that if you'd like to save the chat, please do so. There's if you, in the chat function, look for those 3 dots. And it'll give you an option to save the chat. There's some good questions on the chat. I'll also mention that as a reminder that this video will be posted onto Mass Cultural Council's YouTube page. The link is now in the chat. And thank you so much for coming to the webinar. Happy to hang on and answer any questions that folks might have. But otherwise, if you need to go, you need to go. It's a busy Friday, so feel free to log off if you're able. Otherwise, we are here. And if you have any questions, feel free to activate your video or type it into the chat, unmute yourselves. We can have a quick conversation with folks who have questions. I'm seeing some folks logging off. And any questions that that you all have for your festivals? Great. I'm getting a lot of thank you messages. Great. I think you have run through all of the questions, Angela, at the moment. Any parting thoughts about creating surveys for festivals? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say great. Nope. I think that's it for us today.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thus ends our webinar. Have a great day.
Okay.